In the quiet village of Greenfield, life had become harder with each passing day. The old brick buildings that lined Main Street stood mostly empty, their dark windows staring out like sad eyes at a community that seemed to be disappearing little by little. Emma Roberts sat at her small wooden kitchen table, looking at the pile of bills she could not pay. The numbers on each paper seemed to grow bigger every time she looked at them. She had once been the head engineer at the town's processing plant, earning good money and feeling proud of her work. But that factory had been closed for 2 long years now, and Emma was just another worried mother trying to figure out how to keep her family together. Her 8-year-old son Tommy was at school, laughing and playing with his friends. He did not know that his mother stayed awake at night wondering if they would have to pack up and leave their little house. Emma did not want to tell him yet. Children should not have to worry about such heavy things. On the other side of town, 72-year-old Margaret Williams was opening the door to her feed store. Everyone called her Maggie. Just like her late husband Henry used to do, she moved slowly now, using her wooden cane to help her walk. But she still came to the store every single morning. The shelves that had once been full of supplies for the local farmers were now half empty. Fewer customers came through the door each week, because there were fewer farms left to supply. But Maggie kept opening the store anyway. It was the last piece of Henry she had left, and she was not ready to let it go. Williams' feed store had been Henry's dream when they were young. He had worked there for 30 years. Knowing every farmer by name and always ready to help with advice about crops and animals. Now Maggie kept his dream alive, even though her heart ached with loneliness every day. Across Greenfield, 26-year-old Beth Turner was kneeling beside a sick calf at the old Peterson farm. She had just finished veterinary school and had come back to her hometown full of hope and big dreams. She wanted to help all the animals in her community and build a successful practice. But reality was much harder than her dreams had been. Most of the farms round Greenfield were struggling or had already closed down completely. There was not enough work to pay her bills, and her student loans felt like a huge mountain that she would never be able to climb over. Beth loved animals and she was good at taking care of them. But being good at something was not enough when there was no work to be found. Sometimes she wondered if she should have stayed in the big city where there were more opportunities. The person facing the biggest problem of all was Tom Fletcher. His family had been working the same 2,000-acre ranch for generations. Tom's great-grandfather had built the first barn with his own hands, and Tom's father had taught him everything about raising cattle and taking care of the land. But 3 years of terrible drought had destroyed almost everything. The grass had turned brown and died. The creek that had always provided water for the cattle had dried up to almost nothing. Most of Tom's cattle had died or had to be sold for a very little money. Now the bank was telling Tom he had only 2 weeks to pay back all the money he owed. 2 weeks to save everything that for generations of Fletcher men had built with their sweat and love. That Tuesday evening, the community center filled up with people who looked tired and worried. The monthly town meeting used to be a place where neighbors shared good news and made plans for festivals and improvements. Now it was just a place to hear about more businesses closing and more families moving away. Mayor Johnson stood at the front of the room, and even his usually cheerful face looked sad and defeated. "I am afraid I have more bad news to share," he said, his voice heavy with disappointment. "The Fletcher Ranch will be sold next month. The bank has made their final decision." A soft murmur of sadness moved through the room like a gentle wave. Everyone knew what this meant. The Fletcher Ranch was not just Tom's home and business. It was a big part of what made Greenfield special. Without it, the town would lose another important piece of its heart. Tom Fletcher sat in the back of the room with his weathered hands folded in his lap. He stared down at the floor because he could not bear to look at his neighbors. He felt like he had failed not just his own family, but everyone in the community who had supported him over the years. That was the moment when Emma Roberts surprised everyone, including herself. She stood up suddenly, her chair making a small, scraping sound on the floor. "What if there was another way?" she said. Her voice was shaking, but it was clear enough for everyone to hear. The room became completely silent. Every person turned to look at her, wondering what this quiet woman with the worried face could possibly have in mind. "What if we did? Not let the ranch die," Emma continued, feeling her confidence grow stronger with each word. "What if we saved it together?" Tom Fletcher looked up for the first time that evening. His eyes met Emma's across the crowded room, and she could see surprise written all over his face. "I have an idea," Emma said, speaking louder now. "It might sound crazy, but I think it could really work. We could turn the ranch into something new, something that belongs to all of us." The room immediately filled with the sound of people whispering to each other. Some shook their heads as if they thought Emma had lost her mind. Others leaned forward in their chairs, curious despite their doubts. "I would like to hear more about this idea," said a voice from the middle of the room. Everyone turned to see that it was Maggie Williams, standing up slowly with the help of her wooden cane. Her old eyes were bright with interest. "Me too," said another voice. This time it was Beth Turner, the young veterinarian, who had also risen to her feet. Tom Fletcher took a deep breath and stood up slowly. His eyes stayed focused on Emma's face. As he spoke, "If you really think there is a chance to save the ranch," he said quietly, "then I am willing to listen to what you have to say." As the meeting came to an end that night, four very different people walked out into the cool evening air together. Emma was a worried mother and former engineer. Maggie was an elderly widow trying to keep her husband's memory alive. Beth was a young professional struggling to find her place. Tom was a rancher facing the loss of everything his family had worked for. They did not know it yet, but they had just taken the very first step toward changing not only their own lives, but the future of their entire community. Sometimes the biggest changes begin with the smallest acts of courage. And Emma's simple question had planted a seed of hope that would soon grow into something wonderful. The next morning, the four people who had shared hope the night before met again at William's feed store. Emma arrived first, carrying a canvas bag full of papers and notebooks. She had stayed up until 3 in the morning, drawing pictures and writing down numbers, trying to turn her wild idea into something that might actually work. Maggie unlocked the store door with her old brass key, the same key Henry had used for 30 years. The morning sunlight came through the dusty windows, making golden patterns on the warm wooden floor. She put on a pot of coffee, knowing they would need something warm to help them think clearly. Tom Fletcher arrived in his old blue pickup truck, moving slowly like a man carrying a heavy weight. He had barely slept, thinking about what Emma had said at the town meeting. Could there really be a way to save his ranch? After 3 years of watching everything fall apart, it was hard to believe. In Miracles. Beth Turner was the last to arrive, still wearing her work boots from an early morning call to help a sick horse. Her young face showed both excitement and worry. She had spent the night wondering if she dared to hope that her dreams of staying in Greenfield might actually come true. They gathered round the old wooden table where Maggie used to do her bookkeeping with Henry. The table was scratched and worn from years of use, but it was solid and strong. Emma spread out her papers, showing drawings that looked like maps and lists of numbers written in her neat handwriting. "I could not stop thinking about this all night," Emma said, her voice warm but shaking slightly with nervousness. "What if we created a community farm? Not just Tom's ranch by itself, but something that belongs to everyone in Greenfield. Tom looked confused. He ran his weathered hand through his grey hair, a habit he had when he was trying to understand something difficult. "I do not understand what you mean," he said honestly. "Are you saying I should sell pieces of the ranch to different people?" Emma shook her head quickly. "No, Tom. I mean something completely different. I mean share it. People from town could invest small amounts of money and become partners with us. In return for their investment, they would get fresh food from the farm, and we would all work together to make it successful." Maggie leaned forward on her wooden cane, her old eyes growing bright with interest. "You mean like the old days, when neighbors helped each other during harvest time, when everyone came together to bring in the crops before the weather turned bad?" Emma's face lit up with a smile. "Exactly like that, Maggie. But even bigger than what people used to do. We could grow all kinds of vegetables, raise chickens and goats. Maybe even have a farmer's market where people from other towns would come to buy our food." But's eyes suddenly lit up with understanding. She could see how the pieces might fit together like a puzzle. "I could provide veterinary care for all the animals on the farm. And maybe I could start a mobile service to take care of people's pets right at their homes in town." Tom was quiet for a long moment, staring out the window at his pickup truck parked in the morning sunshine. The truck was old and needed repairs, just like everything else in his life. He was thinking about his great-grandfather, who had come to this land with nothing but strong hands and big dreams. "This ranch has been in my family for 100 years," Tom said slowly, his voice heavy with the weight of history. "My great-grandfather built the first barn with his own hands, using trees he cut down from the back 40 acres. Emma felt her heart sink down into her stomach. She was afraid Tom was going to say no, that he could not bear to change something that had been in his family for so long. But when Tom turned back to look at them, there was something new in his tired eyes, something that looked almost like hope, flickering like a small candle flame. "My great-grandfather built that barn because he believed in taking care of the land and the people who lived on it," Tom continued, his voice growing stronger. "Maybe this is what he would have wanted. Not just keeping the land in the family forever, but keeping it alive and useful for the whole community." Maggie reached across the scratched wooden table and gently patted Tom's weathered hand with her wrinkled fingers. Her touch was soft but full of warmth and understanding. "My Henry always used to say that the best things grow when you plant them in good soil with good people round to help tend them," Maggie said with a gentle smile. Emma opened one of her notebooks and showed them a drawing she had made. It showed the ranch divided into different areas. One section for vegetables, another for fruit trees, a place for chickens and goats, and a big area in the middle for a community gathering space. "We could ask people to invest maybe $50 or $100 each," Emma explained, pointing to her numbers. "That would give us enough money to buy seeds and tools and fix up the buildings. Then, every week, each family would get a box of fresh food from the farm." Beth leaned closer to look at the drawing. "We could have workshops too. I could teach people how to take better care of their pets. You could teach them about growing their own gardens at home." Emma, Tom studied the papers carefully. He was a man who had learned to think slowly and carefully about important decisions. "How many people do you think would want to join something like this?" he asked. "I do not know for sure," Emma admitted honestly. "But I think there are a lot of families in Greenfield who would love to have fresh, healthy food for their children. And I think there are people who miss the feeling of working together towards something good." Maggie poured coffee into her chip mugs and set them on the table. The coffee was strong and hot. and it helped them all feel more awake and ready to tackle big problems. When I was a little girl, Maggie said, my grandmother used to talk about the old community gardens during the hard times. Everyone shared the work, and everyone shared what grew. She said those were some of the happiest times of her life. Even though money was scarce, Emma felt excitement growing in her chest. That is exactly what I am talking about, Maggie. We could bring back that feeling of community, but make it work for today's world. Tom looked round at the three women sitting with him at the old table. A few days ago, he had been facing the loss of everything he cared about. Now, these people were offering him something he had never imagined, a way to save his land by sharing it. If we are going to do this, he said quietly, we will need to move fast. The bank wants their money in less than 2 weeks. Emma nodded. Then we start today. We start right here, right now. The four friends walked into Greenfield Bank on a Wednesday morning, their hearts pounding with nervous hope. Emma carried her folder of papers and drawings, while Tom held his old cowboy hat in his weathered hands. They sat in the hard wooden chairs across from Mr. Davies' big desk, waiting for him to decide their future. Davies was a thin man with wire-rimmed glasses who had been the bank manager for 15 years. He had seen many people come to his office with desperate plans when they could not pay their loans. Most of those plans had failed, and he had learned to be very careful about taking risks with the bank's money. He looked through Emma's papers slowly, studying her drawings and numbers. The room was so quiet they could hear the old clock on the wall ticking away the seconds. Finally, Mr. Davies set the papers down and looked at them over his glasses. I appreciate your creativity, the bank manager said, his voice polite but not encouraging. But this is highly unusual. The bank needs guaranteed payments, not experimental farming projects. Tom sat very still, staring down at his hat. He had expected this answer, but it still felt like a punch to his stomach. Emma felt her heart racing so fast she thought everyone in the room must be able to hear it. But she forced herself to keep her voice calm and steady. Mr. Davies, please give us 90 days, she said, looking directly into his eyes. Just 3 months to prove this can work. The bank manager leaned back in his leather chair, frowning. And what happens if it does not work? Emma swallowed hard before answering. Then you can foreclose on the ranch, just as you were planning to do anyway. Mr. Davies was quiet for what felt like a very long time. Looking at each of the four people sitting across from his desk, he saw Tom's tired face, full of worry about losing everything his family had built. He saw Emma's determined expression, mixed with the fear of a mother who might have to move her child away from the only home he had ever known. He saw Beth's young hope and Maggie's gentle wisdom. 90 days, he said finally, his voice serious. But I will need to see real progress, not just good intentions and pretty plans. Outside the bank, the four friends stood in the bright morning sunshine, feeling both relieved and terrified at the same time. They had won a chance, but now they had to prove they could make their impossible dream come true in less than 3 months. 90 days, Beth said, shaking her head. That is not very long at all. Maggie smiled, but her smile was full of determination rather than worry. Then we better stop talking and start working, she said firmly. The next few weeks turned into a whirlwind of activity that changed all their lives completely. Emma threw herself into the project with all the energy and knowledge she had gained during her years as an engineer. She spent long nights at her kitchen table, drawing plans for water-saving irrigation systems that could be built with pipes and timers that would not cost too much money. She calculated exactly how much water each type of plant would need, and figured out how to make every single drop count. The drought had taught everyone in the area that water was precious. And Emma was determined to use it wisely. Beth decided to start small and build her reputation one animal at a time. She cleaned out her old van and turned it into a mobile veterinary clinic. She painted a sign on the side that said Beth Turner, veterinarian. House calls available in bright blue letters. Every day, Beth drove from house to house, taking care of sick cats and dogs, giving vaccinations to puppies, and helping farmers with their remaining livestock. While she worked, she talked to people about the community farm project, explaining how it would help the whole town. Slowly, people began to trust both her skills as a veterinarian and her vision for the future would spread. That there was a young vet who really cared about animals and was not just trying to make money from desperate pet owners. Maggie transformed her feed store into the heart of their entire operation. She cleared off one wall and created a big bulletin board where people could sign up to invest in the farm. She organized community meetings in the evenings, where Emma could explain the plan to groups of curious neighbors. Most importantly, Maggie used her lifetime of friendships and connections to convince skeptical people to give the project a chance. When someone expressed doubt, Maggie would remind them of all the times the community had pulled together in the past. She had a gift for making people feel like they were part of something important and special. Tom had perhaps the hardest job of all the four partners. He had to learn completely new ways of farming while dealing with the grief of potentially losing his family's legacy. Every day, Emma worked alongside him in the fields, showing him how to plant drought-resistant vegetables in the spaces between the areas where he still grazed his few remaining cattle. One hot afternoon, as they installed a new irrigation line under the blazing sun, Tom paused to wipe sweat from his forehead. "I have been doing this kind of work for 40 years, he said, looking at the modern drip irrigation system they were putting together. My father taught me everything I know. And his father taught him. Now here I am, learning from a woman who is half my age." Emma stopped digging and looked at him with concern, worried that he might be feeling bad about the changes they were making. "Does that bother you, Tom?" she asked gently. Tom smiled. And it was the first real, genuine smile she had seen from him in weeks. The smile transformed his entire weathered face, making him look years younger. "No, Emma," he said, his voice warm with something that sounded like wonder. "It gave me hope. Maybe change is not always about losing something precious. Maybe sometimes it is about finding something even better than what you had before." The first vegetables they planted grew faster and stronger than anyone had expected. The drought-resistant varieties Emma had chosen seemed to love the careful watering system they had installed. Green shoots pushed up through the dark soil, reaching toward the sun with obvious health and vigor. Word began to spread to neighboring towns about the interesting project that was happening in Greenfield. Some people drove over just to see what all the talk was about. A few even asked if they could invest in the farm from their own communities. But not everyone was supportive of what they were trying to do. Some people in Greenfield thought the whole idea was foolish and doomed to fail. One afternoon at the grocery store, Emma overheard Mrs. Henderson talking loudly to other customers about their project. "Mark my words," Mrs. Henderson said in a voice that carried throughout the store. "This whole thing will fall apart within a month. Some people just cannot accept reality when it hits them in the face." Emma felt her cheeks burning with embarrassment and anger, but she said nothing. She simply bought her groceries and walked home, more determined than ever to prove the doubters wrong. October brought the kind of storm that people in Greenfield would remember and talk about for many years to come. The weather forecast on the radio had been calling for some rain, which everyone hoped would help the crops, but nobody expected The fierce winds and dangerous hail that swept across the entire valley on that dark Thursday night. Emma woke up suddenly to the sound of her bedroom windows rattling violently in their frames. Rain was pounding against a roof so hard it sounded like someone was throwing rocks at her house. Her first thought was not about her own safety, but about the vegetables they had planted so carefully. The plants were now just 2 weeks away from their first major harvest, the harvest that would prove to Mr. Davies and everyone else that their community farm could really work. She lay in her bed listening to the storm rage outside, feeling sick, with worry. All their hard work, all their hope, all their dreams were sitting out there in the fields, completely helpless against the angry weather. By morning, the storm had finally passed, leaving behind a strange quiet that felt almost as frightening as the noise had been. Emma dressed quickly and drove to the ranch, her heart pounding with dread about what she might find. The damage was even worse than she had feared. It was heartbreaking to see. The hail had been so strong that it had shredded many of the vegetable plants, leaving torn leaves and broken stems scattered across the muddy ground. The strong winds had knocked down part of the new fencing they had built around the chicken area, and several of the fence posts were lying on their sides like fallen soldiers. Even Buff's mobile veterinary van had not escaped the storm's fury. A large branch from an old oak tree had fallen across the windshield, creating a spiderweb of cracks that made it impossible to see through. Emma, Tom, Beth, and Maggie met at the ranch just after sunrise, standing together in the muddy field, and looking round at all the destruction. The morning sun was shining brightly now, as if the storm had never happened, but the evidence of the night's violence was everywhere they looked. Tom stood very still, his shoulders sagging with the weight of defeat. He had lived through many storms in his 40 years of farming, but this one felt like the final blow to all their hopes. "Maybe this is a sign," he said quietly, his voice heavy with sadness and despair. "Maybe we were just foolish to think we could make this work." Emma felt hot tears staining her eyes, but she tried her best to stay strong for the others. She could not let them give up now, not when they had come so far and worked so hard. "Weaken the plant," she said, though her voice was shaking. "There is still time before winter comes. We can start over." Beth looked round at the damaged plants and broken fencing, her young face full of worry. "But with what money?" she asked gently. "We spent everything we had on the first planting. We do not have enough to buy new seeds and materials." That afternoon, Mr. Davies from the bank came out to see the damage for himself. He walked slowly through the muddy fields, stepping carefully around the broken plants and fallen fence posts. His face showed no emotion, but he kept shaking his head as he looked at the destruction. When he had seen everything, he gathered the 4 partners together and delivered the news they had been dreading. "I am truly sorry," he told them, his voice actually sounding sad. "I know you all worked very hard, and I was starting to believe this project might succeed. But I cannot justify extending the deadline when the crops are destroyed like this. The bank has rules I must follow, and I need to proceed with the foreclosure." Emma wanted to argue with him, to find some way to convince him to give them another chance. But what could she possibly say? The evidence was all round them in the form of broken plants and soggy, muddy ground. Their beautiful dream had been destroyed by forces completely beyond their control. Tom took off his hat and ran his hand through his grey hair, looking older than Emma had ever seen him. Beth stared down at her muddy boots, and Maggie leaned heavily on her wooden cane. They stood there in the ruined field, feeling completely defeated and hopeless. All their hard work, all their planning, all their dreams seemed to have been washed away by one terrible storm. But just as they were about to give up completely, something unexpected and wonderful happened. The sound of a truck engine made them all look toward the ranch driveway. A pickup truck was pulling in, followed by another truck, and then another one behind that. Emma squinted in the afternoon sunlight, trying to see who was coming. The first truck belonged to George Patterson, who owned the hardware store in town. The second truck was driven by Mrs. Chen, who worked at the post office. More vehicles kept driving, creating a small parade of cars and trucks coming down the long dirt driveway. Soon, more than 30 people had gathered in Tom's front yard. Some of these people had been skeptical of the community farm project from the very beginning. Some had never even spoken to Emma or the others before today, but here they were, standing together in the mud and looking ready to help. George Patterson climbed out of his truck with his teenage son beside him. He was carrying a toolbox and wearing old work clothes. "We heard about the storm damage," he said simply, as if that explained everything. "We came to help you fix things up." Double quotes. Mrs. Chen got out of her truck with her husband and two neighbors. They had brought shovels and rakes and boxes of supplies. Emma stared at all these people in amazement. She could hardly believe what she was seeing. "But why?" she asked, her voice full of wonder. "Why would you help us?" Mrs. Chen smiled warmly. "Because you did not give up on our town when things got hard. So we are not going to give up on you." 6 months later, Emma stood in the middle of what had once been an empty lot next to the community center. Now it was filled with colorful tables covered with fresh vegetables, homemade bread, jars of honey, and beautiful handmade crafts. The Greenfield Community Market was bustling with families from 3 different counties who had driven here to buy the best food they had ever tasted. Emma could hardly believe her eyes as she watched children running between the tables while their parents filled baskets with bright red tomatoes, crisp lettuce, and sweet corn. It was hard to remember that this was the same quiet town where she had once sat alone in her kitchen, staring at a pile of bills she could not pay. The community farm had not just survived the terrible storm that had almost destroyed everything. It had grown and flourished beyond anyone's wildest dreams. Tom's Ranch now produced fresh vegetables for over 200 families through their community-supported agriculture program every week. Families came to pick up boxes of food that had been grown right there in Greenfield. The drought-resistant crops that Emma had carefully chosen were producing 30% more food than the old traditional farming methods, while using 40% less precious water. But Smobel Veterinary Service had grown so much that she could barely keep up with all the work. She had hired 2 other young veterinarians to help her, and together they provided animal care to rural families in 4 different counties. For the first time in years, farmers and pet owners could afford to get proper medical care for their animals without having to drive hundreds of miles to the city. Maggie's feed store had become much more than just a place to buy supplies for farms and animals. It was now a certified training center where people from other struggling communities traveled to learn about sustainable farming and community cooperation. Maggie had hired 3 part-time teachers, and classes were held every weekend. But the success of their project had grown far beyond what the 4 friends had originally imagined when they first set out. And that old wooden table, the Greenfield project, had attracted attention from the state university, which sent graduate students to study their methods and write research papers about community-supported agriculture. Professors came to give lectures about what Greenfield had accomplished, and other universities began planning similar programs. A documentary film crew had spent an entire week in Greenfield, interviewing residents about how the community had transformed itself from a dying town into a thriving example of cooperation and hope. The film would be shown on television stations across the country, inspiring other communities to try similar projects, most importantly for the future of Greenfield. Young people were choosing to stay in town instead of leaving for the big cities, like so many had done before. New businesses were opening along Main Street for the first time in years. A bakery, a bookstore, and even a small cafe had opened their doors, bringing life back to the old brick buildings. Families were actually moving to Greenfield from other places because they had heard about the strong sense of community and the healthy way of life that town offered. The elementary school, which had been in danger of closing just a year ago, now had a waiting list of children his parents wanted them to grow up in such a special place. Emma had been offered an amazing new job as a consultant, helping other rural communities develop their own versions of what Greenfield had created. She would travel to small towns across the country, sharing the knowledge and experience they had gained through their hard work and determination. "Are you nervous about the new job?" 9-year-old Tommy asked his mother as they walked through the busy market together. Tommy was now proud to tell his school friends that his mom was helping to save entire towns, just like she had helped save their own home. Emma smiled down at her son, remembering how worried she had been about his future just 6 months ago. A little nervous, she admitted honestly. "But mostly I am excited. I have learned something very important, Tommy. When people work together with kindness and determination, there is almost nothing they cannot accomplish." As they walked past the vegetable tables, Tom Fletcher waved to them from where he was, helping customers choose the best ears of corn. His face looked completely different now than it had during those desperate early days. The worry lines round his eyes had been replaced by smile lines, and he moved with the confidence of a man who knew his life's work had real value. Beth Turner was at the far end of the market, giving free health checkups to people's dogs and cats. A long line of pet owners waited patiently for their turn, chatting with each other about their animals and their gardens. Beth had never imagined that staying in Greenfield could lead to such a successful and fulfilling career. Maggie Williams sat in a comfortable chair near the entrance to the market, greeting everyone who came in and telling visitors the story of how the community farm had started. At 73, she was busier and happier than she had been since Henry died. Her feed store was thriving, and she felt like she was carrying on her husband's legacy in the best possible way. That evening, the 4 friends gathered for their weekly dinner at Maggie's house, a tradition they had started during those intense early months of working to save the ranch. They sat round the same table where they had first planned their impossible dream. But now they were planning for an even bigger future. "I got a phone call today from a town in Montana," Emma told them, as they shared a meal made entirely from food grown on their own farm. "They want help starting their own community farm project." "How many towns is that now?" Beth asked, cutting into a piece of chicken that had been raised right there in Greenfield. 17. Emma answered with a smile that lit up her entire face. 17 different communities that want to try what we have done here. Tom leaned back in his chair, looking more content and peaceful than Emma had ever seen him. "You know what is funny?" he said thoughtfully. "I thought I was going to lose my family's legacy when the bank wanted to take the ranch instead. I found out that the best way to honor the past is to build something good for the future." The end.